Hey everybody, welcome to the Afterburn podcast and another installation of the Lowdown. I am Flash McVeigh. I'm here with Toad Williamson and Zero Fox. We're going to talk about a lot of the happenings going on in the world right now, from the transition of power from a lame duck president to a predecessor, to who's who in the Syrian zoo, and then finishing up with President Biden's trip to Angola this week and what it means for great power competition. So when we kind of look at the transition, the peaceful transition of power from one president to another, you have the lame duck period from November to January. And if you think that the transition of power and people making decisions, or presidents, lame duck presidents making decisions that are going to have significant impacts on their predecessor's presidency, being an exception or just being a new thing between President Biden and former President and President-elect Trump, you are incorrect. It is actually the norm throughout history, from all the way back in Jefferson's time to when Lincoln was elected elected as the president. Apologies. When President Buchanan thought that the secession of the 7 states on the day of the election was unconstitutional but not illegal, and his passive approach to that conflict exacerbated the issues of the Civil War. Now, fast forwarding all the way to Lyndon Johnson electing not to run for re-election, halting the bombing in North Vietnam and what that meant for President Nixon. And then what we're seeing today with President Biden electing to utilize long-range missiles, authorize long-range missile attacks from Ukraine into Russia using American assets, and what that potentially means for the future. But again, this is not new. Zero. Go with additional examples.
Awesome. Thank you, Flash. And I appreciate that we come on what I would call kind of a current week wrap up podcast. And you've allowed me to then extend this out to, like, since the start of the country, where we can start the framing of this. Ultimately, there's two classifications for what I would call the crisis in transition, or the testing of the country. We've all heard the euphemism after every presidential election that there is ultimately a testing of the new president, or a testing of, in this particular case, a returning president like President Trump. In this instance, you either get the testing coming from the prior administration, an internal testing, right, where they set the table, they either make a mess of the geopolitical situation, or they put it in a different direction of that geopolitical situation that they know the inbound president's going into, or you have external forces that apply pressure. One of the first examples of this comes down to, I would like to say, the transition between President John Adams and President Jefferson. Some of us don't remember that long ago, but in 1797, we had a little thing called the XYZ affair. The XYZ affair actually defined a lot of the early portions of the country. And there's tons of parallels that exist that you could actually extrapolate from to today. Ultimately, the XYZ affair, bottom line up front, was that the French were upset with the United States for having a particular treaty with the British. And as a result, started absconding with, capturing, and holding ships, U.S. trade ships, that we were delivering to Britain at the time, even though we were technically allied with France. So France was holding these ships, and as a result, President John Adams, right before the transition period to President Jefferson, ended up sending diplomats over to France to be able to negotiate the release of these ships. Ultimately, that negotiation was met with a lot of grift and corruption, in so much as the French diplomats stated to them, we're going to need $250,000 before we even begin to speak with you per person. When Adams was questioned by Congress about this, he refused to name the actual French foreign ministers that were demanding this money, and referred to them only as X, Y, and Z. Thus began the term the XYZ affair. Ultimately, what this did was fractured Adams's party, the Federalist Party, and ultimately gave strength to Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans. That fracturing in the Adams Party led to the phrase that there would be millions for defense, but not a cent for tribute. And this extended throughout the entirety of the country at the time. Ultimately, that political polarization led to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the increase of the Federalist powers at the time, and then the subsequent backlash to that Federalist powers as they were trying to censor essentially the population upset with this bribery that was taking place, and a public opinion shift that was at one point very aggressively interventionist towards the French, but then ultimately peeled itself back to be a little bit more, not isolationist, but less warlike interventionist for the Jefferson administration. What's really interesting about this is that it's internal strife between what took place from the prior administration, the Federalists, to the future administration of Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, was that the Democratic Republicans were often very French-friendly. They were Francophiles. Remember, after all, Jefferson served as a dignitary and diplomat within France for many of the Revolutionary War years. And as a result, it really hampered his ability for his administration to be able to govern effectively in dealing with the French because of the XYZ affair that took place in the prior administration. But it's not just internal strife that happens, it's also external. Sometimes external forces want to test the presidency before that current president comes in. In this particular case, one excellent example of that has to do with the Tet Offensive, right? Where the Tet Offensive, knowing for the transition period prior to Lyndon B. Johnson being able to be able to transition to power, took place in January to March of 1968. Ultimately, the Tet Offensive led to Johnson actually stepping down from the presidency at the time, and ultimately led to then the tumult that took place in 1968, and inevitably the election of President Nixon there. So external forces playing that factor. Ultimately, though, there's still internal forces that take place after the fact. You had the Somali incursions with George H.W. Bush. At the time, George H.W. Bush, prior to his transition to Clinton, decided that we wanted to provide humanitarian efforts into Somalia. Humanitarian efforts that likely included 28,000 Marines that got sent to the Horn of Africa to, quote, provide God's work and demonstrate food, assistance, and other different aid to increase that military footprint in Somalia. In this case, 28,000 Marines were essentially used as a significant military presence at all the key distribution areas. This then evolved from that, where we call mission creep, the term we all know very well, from humanitarian mission to an actually war-facing mission. And ultimately, all the necessary means to deliver humanitarian aid included physical force against the targets of the time. Now, this transition between H.W. Bush to Clinton ultimately led to what we know now as the Black Hawk Down incidences that took place in Somalia. But that was, again, a geopolitical decision from a prior administration that was then handed over to a future administration that was then delivered that complex situation. And perhaps one of my favorites, though, stepping back in time a little bit, has to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Eisenhower's transition to Kennedy ultimately led. There was everybody knows of the Bay of Pigs happening under the Kennedy administration. However, in March of 1960, prior to Kennedy taking over and winning the election, Eisenhower had already laid the groundwork for the Cuban Missile Crisis to include training of Cubans inside Florida at the time to be able to learn to take over what it looked like for that country. And then ultimately the different mission sets that they were working with his chief of staff, the secret mission sets they were working on, and the brigades they were training of Cubans to be able to conduct the Bay of Pigs. Finally, what's in the recent era? Okay, we've talked about everything from Adams to Jefferson to Lincoln to Buchanan to Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson and then to George H.W. Bush and Clinton. But Obama to Trump 1 also had significant repercussions for one administration's geopolitical effects, i.e., the arming of moderate rebels in Syria, known as Timber Sycamore, into Syria at the time, and then led that geopolitical decisions made in one administration to the next administration, the Trump 1 administration, to be able to deal with that issue. And interestingly enough, as you can all imagine, this has now raised its ugly head again. And the Syrian crisis, though with a little different flavoring, is back on the menu. And that's something that Toad will talk about a little bit more for modern history.
All right. So as Zero was just talking about, we have the Syrian civil war really get amplified towards we're looking at from like 2012 leaning all the way up until about the end of 2015. That was obviously the most bloody conflict, I would argue, in the world over the last 15 years. At the moment, or I would say about in the last 5 years, the conflict had slowed down quite a bit, and most of the fighting was actually taking place between Turkish groups and Kurdish groups, and then between American forces and Iranian-backed militias. But that all changed on November 27th, so last week, while a lot of Americans were enjoying Thanksgiving. The largest offensive was kicked off in Syria that has taken place dating back all the way to 2019. This offensive has effectively turned Syria into the battlefield on scale, into the battlefield that it was at prior to 2019 in Syria. And so right now it's effectively a gigantic soup sandwich of regional and international actors that have dozens and dozens of bases, and there are tons of groups that are all operating on behalf of different regional actors and international actors within Syria for their specific interest. So what happened specifically with this offensive? So the main thing with the offensive was we had, coming out of the region of Idlib in Syria, we had a group that is known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. HTS is the largest group right now that is in the middle of leading the current offensive. If that doesn't sound familiar to you, that's because it's a relatively new group. They rebranded from what they were back in the day. Back in the day, they were a little known Al Qaeda affiliate within Syria that was known as the Al Nusra Front. And they were effectively the Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria that was responsible for operating exclusively inside of Syria. They rebranded and they denounced their ties with, or they had a split from Al Qaeda in 2016. And since then, they have actually been focusing on basically rebuilding, gaining a stronger presence in the Idlib region, and in more recent times, actually focusing more on governance. So looking a little bit more like what a group like Hezbollah would look like in Lebanon than like a traditional terrorist organization would. So this group, HTS, they left out of Idlib in a surprise attack, and they managed to take control over the second largest, depending on which numbers you look at, the second largest city in Syria, which is the well-known, heavily damaged and embattled city of Aleppo in Syria. Um, After they had taken Aleppo, they immediately bolted south down a major highway in Syria that is known as M5. M5 is critical logistics within Syria because M5 stretches all the way from the northernmost part of northwestern Syria all the way down through all of the major cities, first hitting Hama, then Homs, and then the Syrian capital city of Damascus. Now, at the moment, HTS has managed to conquer every major city down to Hama, and it is assessed that they aren't far, or are at least progressing towards Homs at the moment, with the intent to also have an assault to try to conquer Homs. That is very important at the moment because if they were to take Homs, they would effectively isolate the Syrian government from its Alawite supporters that live in the Mediterranean region of Syria. And it would also isolate the city of Damascus from its ship to shore resupply opportunities that it gets from the Russian government, which owns its only major deep water naval base in the port of Tartus, which is also on the Mediterranean Sea. So that is HTS and what they have done in this conflict. Now, another group has also been involved in this offensive, but this group is more directly affiliated with the Turkish government, and that group is called the Syrian National Army, or the SNA. So back in the day, if you had heard of a group known as the Free Syrian Army, there are small factions within the Free Syrian Army, along with some other groups, basically came together towards the end of 2019 and around 2020, and they just have created this new group that's known as the SNA, and they are directly controlled and work closely in coordination with the Turkish military. This group is important because this group, once Aleppo had been taken, they began to move after specifically Kurdish groups like the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, in the areas that are to the west or to the east of Aleppo, and taking on a lot of Kurdish towns. Now, in the past, the SNA has directly participated in Kurdish military operations to establish a lot of areas of northern Syria where the Kurdish army has basically seized it in order to give themselves a buffer and an operating area so that they can go after various Kurdish groups, which they deem as their number one national security threat. So you've got to remember, in this battlefield, although the United States is backing the Kurdish group known as, or the SDF, which is mostly made up of Kurds, for the country of Turkey, their primary national interest in Syria is defeating Kurdish groups because their largest terrorist threat is a group inside of Turkey that is known as the PKK. And the PKK is closely aligned with a lot of these Kurdish groups that are also operating in Syria as well as within Iraq. And so, if we were to go ahead and zoom out just a little bit, we can see a lot of our regional and national interests that are being acted upon utilizing these various fighting groups within Syria. First of which is going to be Turkey, which is going to likely use these groups, all the gains that they're making, all kinds of gains in northern Syria. They're going to use those in order to consolidate Turkish power and effectively give them a greater foothold in northern Syria to combat some of these Kurdish groups. And then to back up just a little bit more from that, so if we were to flip this around, still talking about direct belligerence and talk about who is actually on the other side of this, the folks that are backing Syria from a regional perspective are primarily I would say the Shia Islam alliance across the region is directly involved in defending the government of Assad at the moment. And so what that means is it's Iran through the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, primarily the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, which used to be led by Qasem Soleimani. Uh, you know, you know, scoff, not with us anymore. But so you have these Iranian aligned militia groups in the Iranian government. They are directly backing the Assad regime all throughout Syria, along with the Russians. So what's Iran's interest? So the strategic interest of Iran is to maintain influence and a presence in Syria so that they have striking range, or they have a striking distance on the country of Israel, but then they also have a land bridge to resupply their tight alliance, their alliance with with Lebanese Hezbollah, which has been getting wrecked by the Israelis in the last couple of months. But right now they're effectively getting stiff armed away from that. But that's one of their main interests and one of their main reasons why they need the Assad regime to stay in power is because of that land bridge to get to their allies and to maintain that stronghold on Israel's doorstep. So that covers Iran and Turkey. They are two of the main backers of the direct belligerents that are involved in this conflict. Now, there's one last group that I do want to talk about, and that is the Sunni Arab interest in the region that have, in this specific circumstance, they're actually backing Bashar al-Assad. That's interesting because throughout the duration of the Syrian civil war, what you saw playing out in Syria was a conflict between a lot of quasi Sunni Arab interest trying to battle and be at odds with a lot of Shia Islam Iranian backed interests that were represented by Assad, Lebanese Hezbollah, and a lot of these Iranian militias. So you had these Sunni Arab countries that were going all in to try to remove the Assad regime. Well, right now, they're not doing that. They're actually making statements in support of Assad. And this shouldn't really surprise anyone, even though it seems a little bit odd, because they've welcomed Assad back into the Arab League about a year ago. And so what you really see being reflected right now is instead of in the past, whenever it was a Sunni Shia struggle with Sunni Arab states battling Iranian backed Shia states with Syria as its battleground, what you see represented right now, although not nearly as boldly as that conflict was, is Arab Sunni states that appear to be potentially more concerned with growing Turkish influence in the region and not necessarily Iranian and Syrian and Russian influence in the region, which would explain their stances. Now, the last thing that I want to touch on, and arguably the most important thing for us because we're Americans, is where are the Americans in this whole thing, and where do our interests lie? So, American forces are throughout Syria, but they're primarily on the eastern side of the Euphrates River, and they are embedded with the SDF, which is that mostly Kurdish fighting force. One hotspot in particular where there's been a lot of fighting taking place recently has been in a city known as Deir ez-Zor, which is on the Euphrates River, but closer to the Syrian-Iraq border. In that instance, you actually have a third, I guess, major front in this conflict because there the belligerents are all different. You have the Syrian Democratic Forces at odds and a standoff at the Euphrates River in the city of Deir ez-Zor with Iranian-aligned militia groups and the Syrian government, and you have American forces actively providing close air support as well as other defensive capabilities to defend our interest in the SDF. The final point that I want to make about this, as an American, if you're looking at this conflict and you're wondering what is our primary interest, one thing that I would mention is that we have a whole lot of interest in Syria that stem from who our allies are in the region and what their goals are. But one thing that all Americans should be worried about is that in a country like Syria, the most dangerous and most direct threat to the United States is when that country becomes a region of disorder and lawlessness, or effectively a giant failed state. And the reason for that is because a failed state becomes a breeding ground where you could have Salafist or Islamist groups training and planning under the noise floor of the rest of the chaos to go and conduct attacks everywhere else in the world. And so from the United States perspective, we have to support and defend our allies that are fighting there. But the other thing is we have to support a solution that will restore order and governance so that a lot of these terrorist groups that are direct threats to the United States don't find a safe haven to be able to launch attacks against us from.
And with that, what conflict looks like in 2024. Zero, take us home with President Biden's trip to Angola and what it means in this great power competition of what we see today.
Yeah, if anybody was paying attention to the news recently, you got a chance to see that President Biden made his first sub-Saharan Africa trip in the last month of his presidency. He recently arrived to the country of, checks notes, Angola, of all places, on the 3rd of December. And then we were able to then ask ourselves now, why is that? Now, if you ask yourself, why did he end up going to Angola, of all places, you have to look at a little bit of a zoomed out picture here, as Toad just expertly described, between a very complicated conflict between massive numbers of insurgent groups with very conflicting interests and different needs, and some are allies and some are not, and some were allies but maybe not now, and how those transitions happen. What Angola represents ultimately is the future battleground of economics, the current battleground of economic statecraft, and the future battleground of a soft war of what I would call resource-rich periphery states. Ultimately, everybody talks about the South Pacific between the United States and China, but there's really actually a deeper understanding going on between the extraction zones, or the resource-rich zones, that are going on in periphery states like Peru, Guyana, and in this particular case, Angola. So why did President Biden go to Angola in the 3rd of December, his only sub-Saharan visit ever in Africa, and ultimately make the claim at that point, we're going to increase our investment into the country? You have to zoom out just a little bit further. As we all know about the Belt and Road Initiative, we've all heard about essentially the debtors' prisons that China ultimately puts in countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Zambia and Zimbabwe and other countries with which they provide essentially a debtors' prison investment towards. Angola was actually the OG, the original gangster, of the first one where this took place. In 2002, Angola ended their civil war finally, and they were in desperate need of actual resource investment into their country. And along came China at the time. China instilled at that point the first country ultimately with which they provided that oil resource-backed loans, or otherwise known as oil for food, or in this particular case, oil for infrastructure backing from the Chinese. In order to be able to produce and get more energy out of oil-rich Angola, the Chinese were paying for the actual oil extraction equipment and the infrastructure to be able to extract that resource, that energy, out of the country. In exchange, China was able to build for them hydroelectric dams, roads, anything of that nature over the last several decades. Ultimately, though, the balance of the trade relationship got a little out of whack, and that's a little bit interesting for China. Ultimately, China were used to them being a primary exporter to the rest of the world. However, in Angola, what's interesting is they were a 6-to-1 offset importer compared to their export needs. That means that Angola was actually giving a ton to China. Ultimately, 72% of all of their oil from Angola went to the Chinese. The rest of it either stayed internal to their country, and ultimately China was their only oil export partner. This eclipsed to a high watermark, and you can learn a lot about this in Toad's Substack, but the high watermark of roughly 8 to 10% of all Chinese oil actually came from Angola in certain periods of the 2010 timeframe. It was actually their second largest importer of oil, next to Saudi Arabia, from a foreign nation coming into China at the time. So that large export imbalance, that 6-to-1 ratio, the 72% going to China at the time, this led to, I would say, an outsized number of influence of the Angolese and the Chinese together. So naturally, you can see the U.S. would have interest there to want to apply influence for a country that's on the Atlantic coast in sub-Saharan Africa that we could apply influence towards, noting that China doesn't necessarily have the best reach in the world. It also has other interests for us, the access to landlocked DRC. Angola shares a border with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or otherwise known as the DRC. DRC is important to the whole entire world because it has a number of resources, in particular the 2 C's, copper and cobalt, and the 3 T's, tin, tantalum, and tungsten. It's tough getting stuff out of DRC. It often takes upwards of 35 to 40 days to get anything out of that landlocked country and get that into either the Atlantic or to the Indian Ocean side of the continent. Ultimately, what this led to was in the past several years, the United States and predominantly the West investing in multiple billions of dollars into Angola under green energy deals to be able to build rail lines into the DRC. Ultimately, these green energy deals were designed to be able to build improved infrastructure to be able to take out DRC minerals faster. And that was going to be known as extorting minerals out of exporting minerals out of the Lobito corridor. In 2023, Angola and China and their relationship starts to deteriorate a little bit because Angola leaves OPEC, wants to produce more oil. The numbers are starting to dwindle. China realizes, oh crap, we're a little bit too dependent on Angola. We need to diversify. Angola drops from number 2 to number 8 on the oil export list to China. And ultimately, the result of that is the United States sees an opportunity at that point to be able to instill our influences into Angola to decrease Chinese influence while at the same time extracting minerals out of DRC. And that's where you end up getting the infrastructure projects from companies like Ivanhoe, which is a copper mining company that works out of DRC and most of Angola, which ends up building rail infrastructure. And of note, the most important part of this, which is a little known mining newsletter that came out back in August of 2024, stated that they were able to do a land speed record of a 6-day extraction of copper cathodes out of DRC to the port. Now, that sounds like very nerdy crap talk that nobody really cares about, except for the fact when you compare the fact that 6 days to get copper cathodes out of DRC, the Chinese takes them 35 to 40 days to get it out to the Indian Ocean side. And that 5 times faster mark is going to equal a lot of dollars in the future. So, Angola is a periphery state with which there's economic statecraft and economic warfare, you can make the argument that's going on. So President Biden's visit, though nice, though very pleasant, often has deeper undertones to the broader geopolitical picture. And hopefully, and what we could also plan on seeing as Intel members is projecting what that looks like for the future. And the best person for that has been a lot of the writings from Toad Substack, looking into the inspection of Angola, of Peru, of Guyana, of Central America, a lot of Western Hemisphere investments. But there will be a future to where a conflict looks a lot like insurgent operations taking place in Syria, mixed with a lot of resource extraction operations taking place in periphery states. It's not all the South China Sea.
And with that, that's when we're talking about this is what great power competition looks like. It doesn't look or take place in the places that you typically expect. You would never think that a logistics and infrastructure investment from the United States on the African continent and in countries like Angola and the DRC would have impacts between U.S. and China. And then additionally, all of the soup sandwich that Toad talked about in Syria with everything going on in the Middle East is actually potentially a conflict between the United States, Syria, Iran, and Russia, as well as having a little bit of Turkey rolled into there. So like we're an ally with Turkey, but they are closely aligned with Russia as well. And then additionally, let's not forget that there is a massive active conflict going on in the European theater between Russia and Ukraine with the impact on the Russian economy. And all of that is going back to the beginning, happening in a transitional period in the United States that happens every 4 to 8 years between one president to the next. And when we look at it and we say that these transitions are new, they are not new. This is what it's going to look like forever because it always has been. So with that, guys, thank you for listening to the lowdown, this quick hitting take on what's been going on. Check out the newsletter of the Afterburn podcast, free to all subscribers. And then we'll also put the link to Toad's Substack and Layman Geopolitics, where you can take a look at all this and dive even deeper into it at your leisure. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.